Okay, let's dive into something that I think is pretty mind-bending. We're going to unpack a concept from constructive mathematics that might totally flip the way you think about a really basic idea, the idea of sameness.
So let's start with a simple question. Look at your screen. Are these two letters the same? Seriously, what's your first instinct?
Because, if we're being super literal about it, of course not. They're two different patterns of light, two separate smudges of pixels occupying completely different spots. Physically, they are totally unique. And yet, I bet you didn't even hesitate. For the purpose of reading, you instantly treated them as identical. You just knew they both represented the letter A, and you moved on.
That little mental jump you just performed, that wasn't automatic. That was an active choice your brain made. You just performed an act of abstraction, specifically something called an abstraction of identification.
Most of us go through life thinking that sameness is just a property that things have, right? We think we're just noticing it, finding it out there in the world like spotting a rock or a tree. Well, here's the radical idea that mathematicians like A. Markov put forward. What if identity isn't something we find, but something we construct? What if sameness is something we actively create in our minds for a very specific reason?
And that brings us to the formal definition. It's an active cognitive process of creating sameness. We establish a relationship. And here's the most important part. It's always tied to a purpose. We decide two things are the same because it's useful for whatever we're trying to accomplish.
So, let's break that down. First, it's a constructive operation. We are literally building the idea of sameness in our head. Second, it's a top-down decision. Our goal dictates what gets to count as the same. And third, it's a way to handle the insane amount of variety in the world. We draw a circle around a bunch of different things and say, okay, everything in here is the same for now.
So the process is pretty straightforward when you lay it out. Step 1, you see all the messy differences in the world. Every single A looks a tiny bit different. Step 2, you set a purpose, like I want to read this sentence, and boom. Step 3, based on that purpose, you build sameness. You decide all those different looking marks are just the letter A.
Now, I know what you might be thinking. This sounds a little bit like we can just make stuff up, right? That we can decide anything is the same as anything else. But that's not it at all. This mental construction has to follow a really strict logical rulebook to actually work.
And that rulebook is built on these three fundamental axioms of equality. First, there's reflexivity. A is A. A thing has to be itself. Pretty simple. Second, symmetry. If A is the same as B, then B has to be the same as A. It goes both ways. And finally, transitivity. If A is B and B is C, then A has to be C. You can pass the sameness along.
And these three rules? They're not just for mathematicians. They are the absolute bedrock of any kind of logical thinking we do. Without them, everything just falls apart. Okay, so we're building sameness in our heads, and we're following these strict rules. But what's the big payoff here? Why should any of us care about this kind of abstract concept?
Well, it's because this little act of identification we do is the hidden key, the secret ingredient for understanding one of the most basic principles of all of logic, something you use every single day.
And that thing is this, the logical contradiction, the idea that something can't be both A and not A at the same time. A thing can't be a circle and not a circle simultaneously. It feels like the most obvious truth in the universe. But hold on. For that statement, A and not A, to even make sense, for your brain to even register it as a contradiction, something else has to happen first. And here's the kicker, straight from the source. The very meaningfulness of a contradiction actually presupposes that you've recognized the A in the first part is identical to the A in the second part.
Let that just sink in for a moment. Before you can even identify a contradiction, you have to perform an act of identification. You have to decide that the A on the left is the same as the A on the right. That means that one of the most basic laws of logic is built on top of an active, constructive choice that you make.
So let's just quickly recap the main points. Identity isn't something we just find lying around. It's something we build. It's a decision we make based on a purpose. It has to follow three core logical rules. And, maybe the wildest part, it is the invisible foundation that makes the very concept of a contradiction possible.
And that leaves us with one final question to think about. If this is true for something as fundamental as logic, where else in your life are you doing this? When you talk about people, or ideas, or even your own experiences, where are you actively deciding what gets to be the same, and maybe more importantly, why?